Victor Harrington adjusted his cufflinks for the third time as he surveyed the skyline through the glass walls of his penthouse office. The sun dipped low over Manhattan, the golden hour casting a warm glow over the steel and glass monoliths that bore his name. Harrington Properties had once again dominated the real estate sector, closing another billion-dollar deal just hours ago. The victory should have exhilarated him, but Victor felt the same gnawing emptiness that had crept into his life for years. He turned away from the view, running a hand through his meticulously styled salt and pepper hair. "Sir, anything else before I leave?" Clara Martinez, his assistant of nearly a decade, stood at the doorway, a tablet tucked under her arm. Her voice, as always, was calm and professional. Victor waved a hand dismissively. "No, Clara, that will be all." Clara hesitated, her lips parting as though she wanted to say something more, but she thought better of it. "Good night, Mr. Harrington." Her heels clicked against the marble floors, the sound fading as the door closed behind her. Victor sighed, looking down at the papers spread across his desk. Spreadsheets, contracts, blueprints. They were the tools of his trade, the instruments of his success, and yet, they felt weightless in his hands. For years, Victor had told himself that his work defined him, that the skyscrapers piercing the Manhattan skyline were his legacy. But now, as silence enveloped his office, he couldn't ignore the creeping realization that he was little more than an empty shell, a man defined by profits and acquisitions. Disconnected from the world around him, he packed his briefcase methodically, his movements precise but mechanical. The elevator ride down was solitary and silent, as it always was. Outside, his driver waited by the sleek black town car. But Victor hesitated. "Take the evening off," Victor said abruptly. The driver blinked in surprise but nodded, stepping aside as Victor began walking down the bustling city street. For reasons he couldn't articulate, Victor turned toward the park, a place he hadn't visited in years. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of blooming flowers and the faint hum of distant traffic. He walked without purpose, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel path. The sounds of laughter and conversation filtered through the trees. But Victor kept his head down, unwilling to engage with the world around him. He stopped when he reached the edge of a playground. A father pushed his daughter on a swing, her laughter ringing out like a melody. The man's face was alight with joy, his focus entirely on the child before him. Victor watched, an unfamiliar ache blooming in his chest. He had no children of his own, no one to share in his success, or his failures. Shaking off the thought, Victor turned to leave. That was when he saw him. A small figure sat curled on a wooden bench beneath the flickering glow of a street lamp. The boy was hunched over a notebook, his thin frame dwarfed by the oversized hoodie he wore. His fingers moved methodically across the pages, sketching with a focus that seemed almost out of place in the otherwise quiet park. Victor hesitated. He had walked past countless people in need throughout his life, telling himself it wasn't his responsibility to intervene. But something about this boy stopped him. Perhaps it was the intensity of his concentration, or the way his thin shoulders hunched protectively over the notebook. He approached slowly, his footsteps crunching against the gravel. "What are you doing out here?" Victor asked, his voice sharper than he intended. The boy flinched, snapping the notebook shut and clutching it to his chest. His face, illuminated by the street lamp, was strikingly young, no more than 10 years old. Victor guessed, but his dark eyes held a wary intelligence that seemed far beyond his years. "Nothing," the boy muttered, his voice low but steady. Victor frowned. "It's late. You shouldn't be out here alone. Where are your parents?" The boy's fingers tightened around the notebook. "My dad, he's working. I'm waiting for him." Victor glanced around the empty park, his unease growing. "Working? At this hour? How long have you been waiting?" The boy hesitated, then shrugged. "A few days." Victor's stomach clenched. "A few days?" His tone softened. "What's your name?" "Malcolm." The boy's chin lifted slightly, a quiet pride in his voice despite the circumstances. Victor knelt to meet the boy's gaze. "Malcolm, it's not safe for you to be out here. Let me help you." "I'm fine," Malcolm interrupted, clutching his notebook tighter. "I've got my dad's book, and he's going to come back. He told me to wait right here." Victor's gaze flicked to the notebook. The cover was scuffed and worn, the name, Marcus, etched in neat handwriting on the front. He exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He couldn't just leave the boy here. But he also couldn't force him to trust him. How about this? Victor said carefully. Let me get you something to eat. We'll come back to the park after. And you can wait for your dad. Malcolm hesitated, his wary eyes scanning Victor's face. Why do you care? The question caught Victor off guard. He didn't have an answer, at least. Not one he could articulate. Because I know what it's like to feel alone, he said finally. After a long pause, Malcolm nodded. Okay, but just for a little while. Victor extended a hand, but the boy didn't take it. Instead, Malcolm rose to his feet, clutching his notebook like a lifeline. Together, they walked toward Victor's car, the glow of the street lamp fading behind them. Victor guided Malcolm into the passenger seat of his car, noticing how the boy hesitated before climbing in. Once inside, Malcolm's eyes widened at the leather interior and sleek dashboard. But he said nothing. Victor drove to a nearby diner, a quiet place where they could talk without drawing too much attention. Malcolm barely glanced at the menu, instead pulling his notebook onto his lap and flipping it open. The pages were filled with detailed sketches of buildings, bridges, and mechanical diagrams, all labeled with neat, precise handwriting. You did these? Victor asked, surprised. Malcolm nodded. My dad taught me. He's the best builder there is. He said if I study hard, I can be an engineer someday. Victor's chest tightened. And where is your dad now? Malcolm's fingers stilled. He usually meets me at the park. But he hasn't come yet. Victor leaned back, his mind racing. He had a sinking suspicion that Malcolm's father wasn't coming back, and that this boy, so full of potential, was on his own. When their food arrived, Victor watched as Malcolm ate quickly. His small frame hunched protectively over the plate. The boy's hunger was evident, but he never once asked for more. Victor felt a pang of guilt. How many people like Malcolm had he ignored over the years? As they finished their meal, Victor made a decision. Malcolm, why don't you stay at my house tonight? It's warm, and you can have a proper bed to sleep in. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. Malcolm hesitated, his gaze flicking to his notebook. I don't know. I promise. You'll be safe, Victor said softly, and we'll come back to the park first thing in the morning. After a long pause, Malcolm nodded. Okay. Victor smiled faintly, feeling a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, purpose. The ride to Victor's penthouse was quiet. Malcolm sat stiffly in the passenger seat, clutching his notebook like a lifeline. Victor glanced at him occasionally, wondering how such a young boy could carry so much weight on his small shoulders. When they arrived at the building, Malcolm's eyes widened at the grandeur of the marble lobby. The doorman greeted Victor with the usual respect, but his gaze lingered on Malcolm, his brows furrowing slightly. Victor gave a quick nod, silently conveying that the boy was with him. The elevator ride up to the top floor was tense. Malcolm shifted on his feet, his small body visibly exhausted but still guarded. When the elevator doors slid open, Victor gestured for Malcolm to follow. The penthouse was sleek and modern, every detail carefully curated to exude wealth and power. But as Victor led Malcolm through the spacious living area, he suddenly saw it through the boy's eyes, cold, impersonal, and devoid of life. This is your house? Malcolm asked, his voice quiet but laced with disbelief. Yes, Victor said, setting his briefcase on a nearby table. It's just me here. Malcolm nodded but said nothing more. Victor showed him to a guest room, one of several, where a king-sized bed dominated the space. The boy hesitated at the doorway, his fingers tightening around his notebook. You can stay here tonight, Victor said gently. There's a bathroom through that door. And if you need anything, I'll be right down the hall. Malcolm glanced around the room, his expression unreadable. Thanks, he murmured, stepping inside. Victor lingered for a moment before retreating to his own room. He loosened his tie and sat on the edge of his bed, running a hand through his hair. He had no idea what he was doing. Taking in a stranger, a child, no less, was completely out of character for him. But the memory of Malcolm huddled under that street lamp wouldn't leave his mind. That night, Victor lay awake, listening for any sound from the guest room. The house, usually silent, felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. Victor woke early the next morning, a habit ingrained from years of early meetings and high-stakes negotiations. He was surprised to find Malcolm already awake, sitting cross-legged at the dining table with his notebook open. The boy's brow was furrowed in concentration as he sketched what looked like the frame of a suspension bridge. "You're up early," Victor said, walking into the kitchen. Malcolm looked up, startled. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted. He hesitated, then added, "Your house is really quiet." Victor nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "It usually is." He began preparing breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast. Simple enough to manage. When he placed a plate in front of Malcolm, the boy's eyes lit up with a mix of surprise and gratitude. "Thanks," Malcolm said, tucking in quickly. Victor sat across from him, sipping his coffee as he watched the boy eat. His gaze drifted to the notebook, where Malcolm's precise sketches filled the pages. "Can I see?" Victor asked, gesturing to the notebook. Malcolm hesitated but eventually pushed it across the table. Victor flipped through the pages, his eyebrows rising in surprise. The sketches were detailed and complex, complete with measurements and annotations. It was the work of someone far beyond Malcolm's years. "This is impressive," Victor said. "Where did you learn all this?" "My dad," Malcolm said, his voice soft but filled with pride. "He's a builder. He taught me everything." Victor's stomach clenched at the mention of Malcolm's father. He didn't have the heart to tell the boy what he suspected, that his father might not be coming back. "Do you want to be an engineer?" Victor asked. Malcolm nodded, his eyes brightening. "Yeah, my dad always says I'm going to build skyscrapers someday. Like the ones you build." Victor felt a pang of guilt. His skyscrapers were monuments to his wealth, but they had never felt personal. For Malcolm, the dream of building wasn't about money, it was about passion and purpose. After breakfast, Victor left Malcolm in the living room with a stack of books and puzzles he hadn't touched in years. As the boy quietly occupied himself, Victor retreated to his office and began searching for information about Malcolm's father. He started with the name on the notebook, Marcus. It was a common name, but when Victor added construction and accident to his search, the results were immediate. Marcus Evans, construction worker, fatal accident at Harrington Properties site 6 days ago. Victor's chest tightened as he scanned the article. The details were sparse: an equipment failure, a collapsed scaffold, but the name of the victim struck like a blow. Marcus Evans was Malcolm's father. Victor leaned back in his chair, the weight of the truth settling heavily on his shoulders. He remembered signing off on the project's budget months ago, approving cost-cutting measures to meet deadlines. At the time, it had seemed like a minor decision, a way to maximize profits. But now, faced with the consequences, he felt a deep, gnawing regret. He sat there for a long time, staring at the article. Finally, he picked up his phone and called Clara. "I need you to pull all the safety reports from the 42nd Street project," he said, his voice tight, "and the accident investigation documents. Everything." Clara hesitated. "Is something wrong, sir?" "Yes," Victor said quietly. "Something is very wrong." That evening, Victor sat with Malcolm in the living room. The boy had fallen asleep on the couch, his notebook clutched to his chest. Victor watched him, a mixture of guilt and determination swirling within him. He couldn't undo what had happened to Marcus, but he could take responsibility. He could ensure Malcolm had the future his father had dreamed of. Victor stood and gently lifted Malcolm, carrying him to the guest room. As he tucked the boy into bed, he made a silent vow: he would do whatever it took to make things right. The next morning, Victor began making calls. He started with his project managers, demanding answers about the accident. He reached out to lawyers, architects, and engineers, determined to uncover the truth about what had gone wrong. And, most importantly, he began laying the groundwork for a plan, one that would ensure no other family would endure what Malcolm had. But for now, he kept the truth from Malcolm. The boy had already lost so much. Victor wasn't ready to shatter what little hope he still held onto. Victor Harrington leaned back in his chair, the glow of his computer screen casting shadows across his face. The documents Clara had sent over were sprawled across his desk: safety inspection reports, equipment logs, and internal emails from the 42nd Street project. As he sifted through the information, a pattern began to emerge. Corners had been cut, maintenance schedules had been delayed, equipment that should have been replaced months earlier was still in use. All of it to save costs and meet deadlines. Victor's jaw tightened as he came across an email chain from his senior project manager, Harold Drummond, The language was clear, if not outright incriminating. Let's hold off on replacing the scaffolding until the next quarter. We'll patch it up for now, it's cheaper. And the deadlines won't wait. Victor clenched his fists. He remembered signing off on a budget adjustment for the project, trusting his managers to handle the details responsibly. He hadn't looked closely enough. He hadn't asked the hard questions. And now Marcus Evans was dead because of it. He stared at the name in the reports, the weight of guilt pressing down on him. Marcus hadn't just been another worker. He was Malcolm's father, a man who had clearly cared deeply about his son, a man whose life had been cut short because Victor had valued profits over people. Victor closed his laptop and exhaled slowly. He couldn't change the past, but he could take responsibility for the future. He picked up his phone and called Clara. "I need to meet with Harold Drummond," Victor said, his voice sharp. "Today." Clara hesitated. "Harold's already scheduled for the quarterly meeting tomorrow. Should I move it up?" "No," Victor said firmly. "This won't wait." Harold Drummond arrived at Victor's office that afternoon, his confident stride faltering slightly as he noticed the tension in Victor's posture. Victor didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've been reviewing the 42nd Street project," Victor began, sliding a copy of the damning email across the desk. "Care to explain this?" Harold glanced at the email, his expression carefully neutral. "Victor, these kinds of adjustments happen all the time. It's standard practice to manage costs." Victor's voice hardened. "Standard practice? A man died. Harold, Marcus Evans is dead because of your adjustments." Harold shifted uncomfortably but held his ground. "Look, Victor, you signed off on the budget cuts. You knew the risks. I trusted you to ensure those cuts didn't compromise safety." Victor interrupted, his tone icy. That trust was misplaced. For a moment, Harold didn't respond. Then he leaned back in his chair, his expression turning defensive. "Victor, if you start digging into this, it's going to cause problems. Lawsuits, bad PR, investors will panic. Do you really want to risk that?" Victor stared at him, the weight of his decision pressing down like a physical force. For years, he had operated on the same logic Harold was using now, minimizing risks, avoiding controversy, protecting the bottom line, but he couldn't do it anymore. Not after Malcolm, not after Marcus. "Yes," Victor said finally, his voice steady. "I do." Victor spent the evening pacing his living room, rehearsing the conversation he knew he had to have with Malcolm. The boy deserved to know the truth, about his father, about the accident, about Victor's role in it. But the thought of shattering Malcolm's hope made Victor's stomach churn. Malcolm was sitting at the dining table, his notebook open, when Victor finally sat down across from him. "Malcolm," Victor began carefully, "I need to talk to you about something." The boy looked up, his expression wary. "What is it?" Victor took a deep breath. "It's about your dad." Malcolm's grip on his pencil tightened. "Did you find him? Did he call?" Victor's heart ached at the hope in the boy's voice. He shook his head. "No, Malcolm, I didn't find him, but I found out what happened." Malcolm's face fell, his eyes darting to his notebook. "What do you mean?" Victor hesitated, then reached across the table to place a hand on Malcolm's. "Your dad, there was an accident at one of my company's construction sites." The boy froze, his eyes widening. "An accident?" Victor nodded, his voice trembling slightly. "The scaffolding collapsed. He didn't make it." For a long moment, Malcolm didn't say anything. Then he pulled his hand away, his face crumpling. "You knew?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "You knew, and you didn't tell me?" "I wanted to tell you," Victor said quickly, his own voice thick with emotion. "But I needed to understand what happened first. I needed to make sure." "You're lying," Malcolm shouted, standing up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. "You just didn't want to deal with me. You're just like everyone else." "That's not true," Victor said, his voice firm but gentle. "Malcolm, listen to me. I didn't know your father. I didn't know he was part of that project. But I should have. I should have known." Malcolm stared at him, tears streaming down his face. "You could have stopped it," he whispered. "You could have saved him." Victor felt the words like a punch to the gut. "I failed your dad," he admitted, "but I won't fail you. I promise." But Malcolm didn't respond. He grabbed his notebook and ran to his room, slamming the door behind him. Victor sat there, the silence in the house now heavier than ever. For the first time in years, he felt completely powerless. Over the next few days, Malcolm barely spoke to Victor. He stayed in his room, poring over his father's notebook, refusing to come out except for meals. Victor gave him space, knowing that trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight. Meanwhile, Victor threw himself into the investigation. He met with lawyers, safety inspectors, and families of other workers affected by similar accidents. He began drafting a public statement, preparing to take full responsibility for the company's failures. Clara watched him work, her usual professional demeanor softening. "You're really doing this," she said one evening as they reviewed the draft. Victor nodded. "It's the least I can do." "Not everyone would," Clara said. "Most people would bury this and move on." Victor shook his head. "I can't bury it. Not anymore." One evening, Victor found Malcolm in the living room, staring at a small model of a bridge he had built from craft materials he found in the guest room. The boy's fingers traced the structure absent-mindedly, his face still clouded with anger and sadness. "Is that one of your dad's designs?" Victor asked, sitting down cautiously. Malcolm shrugged. "It's something he taught me." Victor hesitated, then picked up one of the beams. "It's sturdy. You got a real talent for this." Malcolm didn't respond, but Victor noticed the faintest softening in his posture. "I'd like to help," Victor said gently, "if you'll let me." For the first time in days, Malcolm looked at him, his eyes still wary but not entirely closed off. "Why do you care so much?" he asked quietly. Victor met his gaze. "Because your dad cared about you. And because I care about you too." Malcolm didn't say anything, but he nodded slightly, a small gesture of acceptance. It was a start. The following morning, Victor found Malcolm sitting at the dining table, his notebook open, but his pencil idle in his hand. The boy seemed lost in thought, his eyes distant. Victor hesitated before sitting down across from him, careful not to disrupt the fragile progress they'd made the night before. "I was thinking," Victor began, his tone measured, "maybe we could work on something together. A project." Malcolm looked up, his expression skeptical. "What kind of project?" Victor slid a stack of blank paper across the table. "You got an incredible talent for design. And I've spent my life building things. What if we design something together, a bridge? Maybe?" Malcolm's brow furrowed. "Why a bridge?" Victor smiled faintly. "Because bridges connect things. They're strong, reliable, and they bring people together." Malcolm hesitated, his fingers brushing the edge of his notebook. "Okay," he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "But I get to do the design." Victor chuckled. "Fair enough." They spent the next hour sketching ideas. Malcolm's passion shone through as he explained concepts he'd learned from his father's notes: load-bearing structures, tension, and compression. Victor listened intently, offering small suggestions but mostly letting Malcolm lead. It was the first time in days that the boy seemed truly engaged. As they worked, Malcolm's guarded demeanor began to crack. He started asking Victor questions about his work, about the skyscrapers that bore his name. Victor answered honestly, sharing both his successes and his regrets. By the time they finished for the day, the rough outline of a bridge had taken shape. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, both in the project and in their relationship. While Malcolm worked on refining their bridge design, Victor prepared for one of the most difficult meetings of his career, a confrontation with the Harrington Properties Board of Directors. The boardroom was filled with familiar faces, many of whom had stood by Victor during his meteoric rise in the real estate industry. But as Victor looked around the room, he saw only doubt and resistance. "We've received your proposal," said Harold Drummond, his voice tinged with skepticism. "You want to overhaul safety protocols, allocate funds for worker compensation, and increase project timelines? Victor, these changes will cripple our profits." Victor stood at the head of the table, his hands resting firmly on the polished surface. "Crippling profits is better than crippling lives," he said evenly. "Our company has failed its workers, men like Marcus Evans, who lost their lives because we prioritized money over safety. That ends now." A murmur rippled through the room. Patricia Hall, the company's CFO, adjusted her glasses. "Victor, no one here is against improving safety. But we have shareholders to answer to. We can't just." "We can," Victor interrupted, his voice rising. "And we will. If we don't, this company won't have a future. The public will know what we've done. The lawsuits will come. We need to act now, not just for our workers, but for our integrity." The room fell silent. Victor could see the discomfort in their faces, the fear of change, but he also saw a glimmer of understanding. I've already drafted the changes, Victor continued, sliding a stack of documents across the table. I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you how this company will move forward. Harold leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. And if the board votes against you? Victor's gaze was steady. I hold controlling interest. If I have to, I'll do this alone. The tension in the room was palpable. But Victor didn't waver. He wasn't the same man who had signed off on budget cuts without a second thought. This was about more than profits. It was about doing what was right. Over the next few weeks, Victor's relationship with Malcolm continued to grow. The boy was still cautious, still carrying the weight of his father's loss. But he began to trust Victor in small but meaningful ways. One evening, Victor found Malcolm in the guest room, poring over an engineering textbook. The boy looked up as Victor entered, his expression a mix of curiosity and hesitation. Can I ask you something? Malcolm said. Of course, Victor replied, sitting on the edge of the bed. Malcolm hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the corner of the book. Did my dad ever talk about me? At the sight, I mean. Victor's chest tightened. He wanted to tell Malcolm that Marcus had spoken about him every day. That his co-workers had been inspired by the love Marcus had for his son. But Victor didn't know if it was true. I didn't know your dad personally, Victor admitted, but from what I've learned about him, he was proud of you. I can see it in the way he taught you, the way he wanted you to succeed. Malcolm's shoulders relaxed slightly. He always said education was the most important thing. That's why he worked so hard, so I could go to college. Victor nodded, his voice soft. And you will. I'll make sure of it. Malcolm didn't respond, but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. It was enough. Despite Victor's efforts to control the narrative, news of Marcus Evans's death, and the negligence that had caused it, leaked to the media. Headlines blared accusations. Harrington Properties faces backlash over fatal construction accident. Victor's PR team worked tirelessly to manage the fallout. But the damage was done. Protesters gathered outside the company's headquarters, demanding accountability. Investors began pulling out of major projects. The board grew restless, pressuring Victor to abandon his reforms. But Victor refused to back down. He issued a public apology, taking full responsibility for the company's failures. He announced the creation of a compensation fund for affected families and outlined the new safety measures he was implementing. The backlash was swift and brutal. Critics accused Victor of using Malcolm as a PR shield, exploiting the boy's story to save his reputation. Victor ignored them, focusing instead on the work that needed to be done. Malcolm, however, wasn't so forgiving. Why didn't you tell me this was going to happen? Malcolm demanded one evening, throwing a newspaper onto the dining table. The headline read, CEO's new ward, savior or strategy? Victor sighed. I didn't want you to worry. You didn't want me to know. Malcolm shot back. You're just like them. You only care about your image. That's not true, Victor said, his voice steady. I care about you, Malcolm, more than anything. Malcolm's anger simmered, but he didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed his notebook and stormed off to his room, leaving Victor alone with his regrets. Over the next few days, Victor gave Malcolm space. He focused on his work, pushing forward with the reforms despite the growing resistance from the board and the media. But his mind never strayed far from the boy upstairs. One evening, Victor knocked on Malcolm's door. The boy opened it reluctantly, his expression guarded. I know I've made mistakes, Victor said, but I'm trying to fix them, not just for you, but for everyone who's been hurt by what this company has done. Malcolm stared at him for a long moment. Why do you care so much? Victor's gaze softened. Because you deserve better. Your dad deserved better. And because I care about you. Malcolm, you've become like family to me. Malcolm's eyes flickered with emotion, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stepped aside, allowing Victor to enter. It was a small step, but it was enough to give Victor hope. Victor Harrington's announcement of sweeping reforms at Harrington Properties sent shockwaves through the industry. His plans were ambitious, doubling safety inspections, funding worker training programs, and creating a compensation fund for families affected by past accidents. While some praised his efforts, others, particularly his board, saw the changes as a direct threat to their profits. The media remained relentless. Every step Victor took was scrutinized. Every decision dissected. His sincerity was questioned at every turn. But Victor pressed on. His resolve wasn't for the headlines or public approval. It was for Malcolm and for Marcus. In the evenings, Victor and Malcolm returned to their bridge project. It became their shared sanctuary. A quiet space where the noise of the outside world couldn't reach them. Malcolm's designs grew more intricate. His explanations more confident. The boy's natural talent was undeniable. And Victor took pride in fostering it. "You got a real gift," Victor said one night as they worked on the model together. "Your dad would be proud." Malcolm paused, his pencil hovering over the paper. "You think so?" "I know so," Victor replied firmly. "And I am too." The boy's lips curved into a faint smile, a rare but precious moment of connection. One morning, Victor arrived at the office to find a group of protesters outside the building. They held signs with slogans like, "Justice for Workers," and "Harrington must pay." Malcolm, who had accompanied Victor to the office that day, stared at the crowd through the car window. "Are they mad at you?" Victor hesitated. "They're mad at what this company has done. And they have every right to be." As they stepped out of the car, a reporter rushed toward Victor. Microphone in hand. "Mr. Harrington, what do you say to the families who claim your reforms are too little?" "Too late?" Victor met her gaze steadily. "I say they're right to be angry. I can't change the past. But I'm doing everything in my power to make sure it doesn't happen again." The reporter pressed on, but Victor guided Malcolm through the crowd, shielding him from the chaos. Once inside, Malcolm turned to him, his expression serious. "Do you think they'll forgive you?" he asked. Victor sighed. "I don't know, but I'm not doing this for forgiveness. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do." Malcolm nodded, his respect for Victor growing, even if he didn't say it aloud. Victor's efforts to uncover the truth about Marcus's death led him to a long-overlooked report from the site's foreman. The document detailed the faulty scaffolding and flagged it for replacement, a request that had been ignored by upper management. The paper trail pointed directly to Harold Drummond. Victor's blood boiled as he confronted Harold in the boardroom. "You knew the scaffolding was a hazard," Victor said, slamming the report onto the table. "You ignored it." Harold's expression darkened. "I was following orders, Victor. You wanted profits. And I delivered." Victor's voice was cold. "Not at the cost of human lives." Harold smirked. "Come on, Victor. You're as responsible for this as I am. You signed off on those budgets." Victor's chest tightened. Harold was right, at least partially. Victor had trusted his managers, turning a blind eye to the details. But now, he was determined to take full accountability. "You're fired," Victor said, his voice steady, effective immediately. Harold's smirk faded, replaced by shock. "You can't be serious." "I'm very serious," Victor replied, "and don't think for a second this absolves you. The authorities will hear about this." As Harold stormed out, Victor sat down heavily at the head of the table. The burden of his decisions weighed heavily on him. But he felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time, he was taking steps to make things right. Back at home, Malcolm worked tirelessly on their bridge model, refining the design with meticulous care. Victor joined him at the dining table, marveling at the boy's focus. "You've got the foundation just right," Victor said, examining the structure. "But what about the supports?" Malcolm nodded. "I was thinking about adding diagonal braces to distribute the weight more evenly." Victor smiled. "Good thinking. Show me." As they worked, their conversations grew more personal. Malcolm began sharing stories about his father, how Marcus would bring home scraps of wood and metal for them to build things together. How he'd always explain the science behind every project. "I didn't understand half of what he was saying back then," Malcolm admitted with a small laugh. "But I remember how excited he got when he talked about building things." Victor's heart ached at the boy's bittersweet memories. "He sounds like an incredible man." Malcolm nodded, his gaze dropping to the notebook in his lap. He was. Victor's reforms extended beyond Harrington properties. He partnered with local organizations to fund community projects, starting with a new youth center in the neighborhood where Marcus had lived. The groundbreaking ceremony was small but significant. Victor invited Malcolm to attend, and the boy's eyes lit up as he saw the blueprint for the building. "Is this real?" Malcolm asked, running his fingers over the design. "It's real," Victor said with a smile. "And I thought you might want to help with the design process." Malcolm's jaw dropped. "You mean it?" Of course, Victor replied. This is as much your project as it is mine. The boy beamed, a lightness in his expression that Victor hadn't seen in months. For the first time, Malcolm felt like he was part of something bigger, something that mattered. Just as things seemed to be improving, a former board member leaked confidential emails to the press, painting Victor as a ruthless CEO who had knowingly ignored safety violations for years. The headlines were brutal. Harrington's hypocrisy, reform or reputation repair. Victor's PR team scrambled to contain the damage, but the public backlash was fierce. Investors pulled out of major projects, and employees began questioning Victor's leadership. Malcolm, too, was affected. At school, classmates whispered about the scandal, and some parents forbade their children from interacting with him. One afternoon, Malcolm came home in tears. They think I'm just some charity case, he cried. Like you're only helping me to look good. Victor knelt beside him, his voice steady but gentle. Malcolm, listen to me. What you're doing, matters. Don't let anyone take that away from you. Malcolm sniffled, wiping his eyes. But what if they're right? They're not, Victor said firmly. And I'll prove it, not just to them, but to you. To help Malcolm regain his confidence, Victor encouraged him to enter their bridge model in the school's annual science fair. At first, Malcolm was hesitant, worried about the attention it would bring. But Victor reassured him. This is your work, Victor said. Your talent. Let the world see what you're capable of. The night of the fair, Malcolm stood nervously by their display, his hands fidgeting. But as judges approached, he found his voice. He explained the engineering principles behind the design, his passion shining through with every word. When the winners were announced, Malcolm's name echoed through the gymnasium. He beamed as he accepted the first-place ribbon, his confidence restored. Victor watched from the back of the room, his chest swelling with pride. This wasn't just a victory for Malcolm, it was a step toward healing for both of them. The science fair victory was a turning point for Malcolm. As they drove home that night, the first-place ribbon clutched tightly in his hand. He couldn't stop smiling. Did you see their faces, Victor? He asked excitedly. The judges couldn't believe I built it. Victor chuckled, glancing at the boy in the rearview mirror. I saw. Malcolm, you earned it. Malcolm's expression sobered slightly. Do you think Dad would have been proud? Victor's grip on the steering wheel tightened. I don't think. Malcolm, I know. Your dad would be over the moon seeing what you've accomplished. Malcolm looked down at the ribbon, his fingers tracing the gold lettering. Thanks for everything. Victor's chest tightened. You don't have to thank me. You're family now. That's what family does. The words hung in the air, unspoken but deeply felt. For the first time, Malcolm let himself believe them. Despite Malcolm's personal triumph, Victor's professional life continued to unravel. The leaked emails became the centerpiece of a public campaign against Harrington Properties. Led by former board members Harold Drummond and Patricia Hall, they accused Victor of using reforms as a cover for years of negligence, framing him as a hypocrite who only cared about salvaging his reputation. The media latched onto the story. Protesters gathered outside the company's headquarters daily, their chants audible even from Victor's penthouse. Investors called for his resignation, and several projects ground to a halt as contractors withdrew their support. Clara, ever loyal, worked tirelessly to shield Victor from the worst of the chaos. We need to get ahead of this, she said one evening, handing him a stack of crisis management proposals. A press conference, an interview, something to show people your side of the story. Victor shook his head. This isn't about defending myself, Clara. It's about doing what's right. But if you lose the company, then I lose it, Victor said firmly. What matters is fixing what we broke. Clara hesitated, then nodded. I'll start reaching out to community leaders. If we can get their support, it might soften the blow. Victor exhaled heavily, his mind drifting to Malcolm. The boy had endured so much already. Victor couldn't bear the thought of his mistakes causing Malcolm more pain. Amid the turmoil, Victor and Malcolm continued to work on their bridge project. It became their refuge, a reminder of the good they could create together. One evening, as they were fine-tuning the design, Malcolm hesitated. Victor? Yeah? Victor looked up from the blueprint. Why do you keep trying? With the company. I mean, everyone's so mad at you. Victor leaned back in his chair, considering the question. Because I owe it to them. To your dad. To you. And to every family that's been hurt by what we did. I can't change the past. But I can try to build a better future. Malcolm nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Like the bridge. Victor smiled. Exactly like the bridge. They worked late into the night, their bond strengthening with each passing moment. For Malcolm, it was a chance to carry on his father's legacy. For Victor, it was a way to earn redemption. The following week, Victor held a press conference to address the mounting allegations. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing as Victor stepped up to the podium. I want to start by saying I take full responsibility for the failures of Harrington Properties. He began, his voice steady. Mistakes were made under my leadership, mistakes that cost lives. For that, I am deeply sorry. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. But apologies are not enough. That's why we've implemented comprehensive reforms to ensure these failures never happen again. And that's why I'm here today, not to defend myself, but to take accountability. The reporters peppered him with questions, their voices sharp and probing. Mr. Harrington, do you deny the allegations that you ignored safety violations for years? I don't deny them, Victor said calmly. I acknowledge them, and I'm doing everything in my power to make amends. What about the claims that you're using Malcolm Evans as a PR stunt? Victor's jaw tightened. Malcolm is not a stunt. He's a brilliant young man with a bright future. My relationship with him has nothing to do with saving face and everything to do with honoring his father's legacy. The conference ended with mixed reactions. But Victor stood firm. He had spoken his truth. Now, it was up to the public to decide whether they believed him. In the weeks that followed, the backlash began to soften. Community leaders who had witnessed Victor's efforts firsthand spoke out in his defense, highlighting the tangible changes he had made. Workers from Harrington Properties shared stories of improved conditions and new opportunities. Malcolm's science fair win also gained attention, drawing praise from local engineering organizations. Reporters who had once criticized Victor now portrayed him as a man trying to right his wrongs. Still, not everyone was convinced. Former board members continued to spread misinformation, and some critics remained steadfast in their distrust. But for Victor, the tide was turning. One evening, Victor and Malcolm sat together on the balcony of the penthouse, the city skyline stretching out before them. Their bridge model sat between them, nearly complete. You know, Victor said, his voice thoughtful, this bridge isn't just a project. It's a symbol. A symbol of what? Malcolm asked, tilting his head. Of connection, Victor replied. Of building something strong enough to withstand the weight of the past and carry us into the future. Malcolm nodded, his gaze distant. Do you think we'll finish it? Victor smiled. I know we will. As they worked on the final touches, Victor felt a deep sense of peace. For the first time in years, he wasn't just building for profit, he was building for purpose. And in Malcolm, he saw not just a boy with extraordinary talent, but a partner in creating something truly meaningful. When the bridge model was unveiled at a community exhibition, it drew widespread acclaim. Architects, engineers, and community members alike praised its innovative design and thoughtful safety features. Malcolm stood beside Victor, his chest puffed with pride as he explained the project to visitors. For a boy who had once felt abandoned and invisible, it was a transformative moment, a testament to his resilience and determination. Victor watched him with a mixture of pride and gratitude. In helping Malcolm heal, he had found healing himself. Together, they had built something far greater than a bridge. They had built a family. Victor Harrington sat in his home office, the adoption papers spread across the mahogany desk. The process had been long and grueling, but at last, it was nearing completion. He picked up his pen, his hand steady as he signed his name on the final document. Clara stood nearby, her expression warm. That's it, she said softly. It's official. Victor leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. He's my son now. Clara smiled. He's always been your son. Victor, this just makes it legal. Victor glanced out the window where Malcolm was in the garden, sketching designs in a notebook. The boy had come so far, from a scared child huddled under a street lamp to a confident young man ready to take on the world. Victor had made mistakes, many of them, but today, he felt like he'd finally done something right. That evening, Victor gave Malcolm the news. They sat together at the dining table, the adoption papers between them. You're officially a Harrington, Victor said, his voice thick with emotion. If that's what you want. Malcolm stared at the papers, his fingers tracing the edges. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, his eyes met Victor's. I wanted this for a while, he said quietly, but I didn't know if you really wanted me. Victor's heart clenched. He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. I've wanted you to be my son since the day I found you in that park. You're not just part of my life. Malcolm, you are my life. Malcolm's lips quivered, but he managed a small smile. Thanks, Dad. The word hit Victor like a tidal wave. He pulled Malcolm into a hug, holding him tightly. In that moment, every mistake, every regret, every burden he had carried seemed to melt away. The final step in the adoption process was a court hearing. Victor and Malcolm sat side by side as the judge reviewed their case. The room was quiet, save for the rustle of papers and the judge's measured voice. Mr. Harrington, the judge said, peering over her glasses, you've undergone a significant transformation, both as a businessman and as a person. Why do you want to adopt Malcolm? Victor stood, his voice steady but emotional. Because Malcolm has given me a second chance. A chance to be more than a businessman. A chance to be a father. He's inspired me to be better. To do better. And I want to give him the home, the love, and the future he deserves. The judge nodded, her gaze softening. And Malcolm, do you want Mr. Harrington to be your father? Malcolm glanced at Victor, then back at the judge. He already is. The judge smiled. In that case, it is my pleasure to grant this adoption. Congratulations to you both. Applause erupted from the small group of supporters in the room, including Clara and several Harrington Properties employees who had come to show their support. Victor and Malcolm hugged tightly. Their bond solidified in the eyes of the law. In the months that followed, Harrington Properties underwent a complete transformation. Victor's reforms became the gold standard for safety and ethics in the construction industry. The company partnered with trade schools and engineering programs, offering scholarships to underprivileged students. One of those scholarships was named the Marcus Evans Memorial Fund, honoring Malcolm's father and his dream of a better future. The community center Malcolm had helped design was completed and opened to widespread acclaim. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Malcolm stood beside Victor, addressing the crowd with a poise far beyond his years. This center isn't just a building, Malcolm said. It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we work together, when we care about each other. My dad taught me that great things aren't just built with skill but with heart. And that's what this place represents. Victor watched with pride as Malcolm cut the ribbon, the applause ringing in his ears. The boy who had once been lost was now a leader, a builder of dreams. Years passed, and Malcolm's star continued to rise. He graduated at the top of his class from one of the nation's most prestigious engineering programs, earning accolades for his innovative designs and commitment to sustainability. Victor was there at every milestone, his pride in Malcolm growing with each achievement. One day, Malcolm approached Victor with a set of blueprints. I want to build something big, he said, his eyes gleaming, something that will change the world. Victor smiled. I think you already have. Together, they began planning a revolutionary project, a bridge that would connect two struggling communities, both physically and symbolically. It was a project born from their shared journey, a testament to their bond and their commitment to making the world a better place. On the day the bridge was completed, Victor and Malcolm stood side by side, looking out at the structure that now spanned the river. It was a masterpiece of engineering and design, but more importantly, it was a symbol of redemption, resilience, and hope. This is for Dad, Malcolm said softly, his voice filled with emotion. Victor placed a hand on his shoulder. And for you, for the man you've become. As the first cars crossed the bridge, Victor felt a deep sense of peace. He had spent much of his life building monuments to his own success. But this bridge, this legacy, was different. It wasn't about him. It was about Malcolm, about Marcus, about the lives they had touched and the future they had built together. Victor Harrington retired from Harrington Properties a few years later, leaving the company in the capable hands of a new leadership team dedicated to continuing his reforms. Malcolm, now a renowned engineer, carried on his father's legacy and Victor's vision, designing buildings and structures that prioritized people over profits. Their bond remained unbreakable, a testament to the power of love, redemption, and second chances. And though Marcus was gone, his memory lived on in every blueprint Malcolm drew, every project he completed, and every life he touched. As Malcolm stood on the bridge one evening, watching the sun set over the city, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. For his father, for Victor, and for the journey that had brought him here. He smiled, his heart full. This was only the beginning.